Huh?
You should look into the aftermath at some point as well.
Say again.
The aftermath of the Rising. It's way better in many ways.
Well, tell me.
The Union formations is an astounding feat.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like almost like before the Rising, there was a big like push for almost non-violent active kind of pushback. Like they were talking about basically, well, if we can't set our wages, we'll all strike as one, and then we'll all apply for parish relief as one, and the pressure will be overwhelming, so they'll have to give in to our demands. So really sophisticated kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and
then lead into the Chartists.
Yeah. It all
we met with the guys from the Chartists.
It all kind of like leaked into that.
Yeah.
But that was all like the day before the Rising happened. There was this big public meeting, and they were all talking about doing that. And then something shifted, you know, but because there were so many different factions involved in the Rising, and so many different people involved in the different parts of it. Like some people were opportunistic, some people were political and reformed. Some people were just, you know, there and didn't really understand why. There were so many different things going on. And but after the Rising then, it seems like someone hit the reset button and they went back to that same idea of, okay, we lost 20 odd people, we lost this, you know, Dic Penderyn, and all these negative things have come out, you know, and arguably the workers came out worse, you know, of the Rising than anyone. And so in the aftermath, they then go, right, let's revert back to our plan, you know, of, you know, trying to set our wages, form unions. And so they formed like what's called union clubs or union parties and stuff like that, because they were legal from 1825.
Right, okay.
Well, a version of them were legal from 1825. So they started doing these. And
that's another area, I suppose, where we've had to lean a little bit from poetic license, because in the film, not so much in the play, but definitely in the film, we've made the secret union meetings very much frowned on by the authorities. Very,
and they were hated because the authorities.
But you know, almost to the point where they are suggestedly illegal.
Yeah, they weren't necessarily illegal in any way, shape, or form, really, because they were called like constituted clubs or union groups or stuff like that, and they would have like pamphlets, which they still exist, like the pamphlets of the rules and stuff like that. I'll send you a link. They're really good, and they basically, the main thrust of their work is to set wages. They didn't really care and didn't have any concept really about, you know,
minimum
working
wage.
climate.
I mean, there's parallels.
It was all that.
It's called almost today, you know?
Right, we set wages.
Living wage.
And so they would meet in groups and they would take secret oaths. And they would meet in groups and they could only talk about it in groups. And basically by August 1831, literally there wasn't a single working group that wasn't part of one of these groups. It was vast, like all-encompassing, all the miners, all the iron workers.
Sort of the build-up, and then the 3rd of June 1831, it was almost just unorganised mayhem, chaos.
Totally, totally. And this is is for me, the aftermath is more interesting because it kind of like the Rising. When I have a little look at it, I think the best thing it did was refine the actions of the workers in the aftermath. That's why Gwyneth kind of calls it the birth of the working class and stuff like that, because he's right in many ways. It kind of afterwards, there was this push to do stuff sensibly in a way that wouldn't backfire on themselves constantly, and unification, like all singing from the same hymn sheet and all that. And so you make mention in it of something they do a couple of years after, actually, one of your shorts where they use pressure on shop owners.
I stole that
in a particular way.
I lent it actually from your lecture that I attended.
Oh, there we go. Yeah,
what I really enjoyed about that lecture.
I didn't realise you took it on.
That stuck with me. You know, I obviously have spoken at length with the late Stefan David and Sally. When I attended your lecture in 2022 at the Kia Hardy.
Yes.
What I really liked about that lecture was how you drew parallels with cancel culture from today, and how, you know, back then people formed organisations and through unity managed to make significant beneficial change. A very similar sort of regime.
And they were even voting for people that politically they didn't agree with, but they knew they could get their views through easily with that person rather than that person. So they were politically opposed to the figures they were trying to get into power. It's very much like now we see in with, you know, people tactically voting in Wales, you know, in particular, and stuff like that. It's really similar to all that. But it all kind of stems from that aftermath of the Rising. But yeah, by August, literally like all of the workers in Merthyr just formed unions, and the ironmasters are really patriarchal by nature. They always firmly believe that they're doing right by their workers. There's never an ironmaster in Merthyr that was convinced they were doing the wrong thing. They were really pig-headed in that.
When I was formulating the stage production, working with the other writers, Rob and Sarah, we always felt that it was too obvious a choice. Because, needless to say, you've got to have a villain or villains when you've got a story of a hero.
Yeah.
Which is ultimately what Iniquity is, really. But we felt it was too obvious a choice to make the Ironmasters the villains. I mean, in the film, Melbourne, William Lamb is definitely the villain.
Yeah.
We've made the Ironmasters, Crochet and Guest, almost so far detached from their workers. They're very much businessmen, and they're looking at it purely from, well, what makes sense for their business.
Yeah.
So
that's 100% how I always look at them. It's like sometimes I've done like talks or lectures and talk to people, and I almost come across as like an apologist for the Ironmasters in some way, but I'm never kind of doing that. I'm always like trying to frame it in a way that is essentially
historically accurate.
Yeah, but they just literally, it's a weird thing that we've got today, that we look back on these kind of millionaires and we look at them and expect them to be philanthropic and socially minded and all that, when ultimately they're doing exactly what they want to do and what they've all they care about is their business.
And the absolute irony of it all is these are the people that we've been trying to approach to finance our film, and I've come across quite a few. Thankfully, as I said, Sir Chris Evans and Brian Jones have never mentioned any return on investment. In fact, the first time I pitched the film to Brian, his words to me were, I don't care how much money this film makes, it's a story that needs to be told. Yeah. If I could clone executive producers, he would be. But then, it's a necessary evil in many ways. A lot of the others, they're purely interested in return on investment. What's our uplift? And that's quite a sad irony, really, in terms of the story we're trying to tell and the characters within the story and the people we're trying to get the finance off to make it happen as well.
Crazy, isn't it? It's crazy how it comes around like that. But yeah, the Union Club, I think the aftermath, for me, because I'm a pacifist, I believe non-violent protest is always going to be you'll always find a safe place in my heart if you approach it non-violently.
So do you think the build-up and what happened then on the 3rd of June 1831 was not, say, a peaceful protest? It was a protest fueled by anger, or?
I think there was just so many elements. There were so many different elements. Like, you've got groups of people going over to Aberdeen to forcibly, sign documentation, set wage prices, which seems like more of a peaceful, forceful political approach. But they did threaten violence and things like that, threaten stuff like that to get those documents signed. But then but then you've got other elements which are more like Lewis side of things, where the court's request, where this entirely unfair system of debt retrieval is really making people's lives hard, and so they're taking the opportunity to take their stuff back. Like, there's people in the Rising that are taking stuff back that they haven't had for 3, 4, 5 years. It's literally years ago. There's a family in Calon who were interviewed as part of the trials, and basically a group of people came to their home screaming reform and broke into their house, right, and took artifacts and took articles back that they had bought in auction 3 years prior.
Right,
off this guy. And it's mad.
We've used to try and strike that balance, making it historically accurate, but also compellingly interesting in dramatization, and it is definitely the most difficult challenge I've found, not just with the film now, but with the play. When Stefan got us access to the trial transcript, we took elements not just of what the witnesses said at the trial of Dic Penderyn, but also things like there was a worker who was put up on trial at the assizes in July 1831, Richard Evans. And he says that the workers attacked him. The workers bullied him and beat him up because he wouldn't join the march. And that is, it's not used in the film, but it is used in the play. But then also as well, to contradict that, and I'll almost say what you're saying now, in terms of there were so many different factions. There was clear testimony at those trials in 1831 that large parts of the movement were peaceful.
Yeah, totally.
You know, that the workers were being pressed upon the soldiers because of the throng of numbers.
Yeah.
They weren't actually looking to fight.
Yeah.
They were just being pushed towards them.
And then when you get that, it's weirdly, James Abbott, who was kind of always like framed as a villain in many cases, is kind of his testimony is there's that famous speech that Lewis gives outside where, you know, no one really knows what he said, but Gwynlav came up with a composite version, which essentially boils down to, you know, there won't be protection and I fall on them and take their arms type of thing. But we don't really know what he said. But one of the versions of what he said comes from James Abbott. And James Abbott actually says that he was telling them to calm down and he was just talking about bread and cheese.
Yeah.
He didn't give any commands to like fall on them. That came from other eyewitnesses. And this is what I find weird about the whole thing is like we don't know what Lewis said in that moment, but that iconic, you know, fall on them is being that staple. But there are witnesses that contradict it entirely and make it more like a peaceful and comfortable meeting more than anything, and which is weird. And then you get people like approaching the Iron Masters of Penderyn House with demands, you know, thought out demands, you know, we want A, B, and C, mainly involving wages and stuff like that as well, and articles that they spend money on. And so you've definitely got these different factions going on, I think. And I think Chartism, in particular in the aftermath, was a great unifier of that. It kind of gave an outlet. Everyone had that direction that they could go in, because David Jones, who's an amazing history, he wrote a few articles on Merthyr Rising, and he says it brilliantly, because in the opening of his article on it, he says, I can't believe that they got anything done at all, because they were so ununified and there was nothing like communism or any type of mentality to unify them.
What do you think drove that? Do you think it was just the desperation of the...
You got to look at the wages as well. The wages, we still on what you could call, I suppose, a sliding scale of wages. So wages were linked to iron costs.
Yeah.
And iron was the cheapest it had been ever in that 1 year. You know, and like Arthur Castle, 1825 was the peak, if memory serves. There's witnesses that would talk in public meetings on the iron trade and stuff like that, and they would say, oh, in 1825, a ton of iron was valued between 12 and 14 pounds. But then by 1830, it was valued between 6 and 7. So it literally just, the market had just dipped out. And so it had a massive impact on wages. And so, and again, William Crochet did a good job of kind of fighting his own corner when he was blamed for it. And he said, like, you know, because the main national press blamed his wage cut as the tipping point.
Right.
You know, when he sacked the puddlers and the high wage earners and stuff like that. And his argument was, well, if it was that, you know, it would have happened before, because this happened then, and this happened then, and this happened then. And he was outlining all these different factors that happened. And he was saying if it was just one of those things on its own, it would have been that. But it wasn't. It was all of these things. It was low wages. It was high cost of food and articles of living. Some government report even put down, like, saying that miners wanted to return back to when they could afford the luxuries. And what they mean by that is literally they were getting paid slightly more for their wage so they could afford the things like, you know, clothes, tools, food, whatever, without it having an instant impact on everything. But now they couldn't. And so they wanted a return to, you know, having a normal wage, because they weren't exactly living extravagantly at all. But, and again, you add there then the court's request, which fundamentally is the maddest way to claim debt back.
Conversations of that going on now in my hometown with everything that's going on with the steelworks.
Yeah.
You know, you've got people coming out of there on very, very handsome salaries who've got used to that level of employment and payment and what was once considered a job for life, who are now back on the job market with, you know, not a great deal of skill set other than heavy industry, and not enough jobs to provide them with that sort of level of employment again.
Exactly. It's really hard when you get accustomed to it, and you're talking after the Napoleonic Wars ended and trade routes opened back up again, because the main reason that the industry slumped in the Napoleonic Wars is because the country lacked funds to buy anything, so no one was buying stuff really. And then war wasn't there, so you didn't have that instant war fund to fund iron making. So now we were in a really weird place where no one was buying armaments, but no one had any money either. So there was a definite slump in the aftermath. But then when it started recovering and it started kind of going well, you had a good 10-year of rise. And then 1830 it, and it never returned back to those levels prior.
It goes back to
Ever.
there's so many parallels, Chris.
Yeah.
You know, one of my heroes is Tony Benn.
Oh yeah.
You know, when he spoke about we can find money for wars and for instruments of destruction. That's why I think, you know, the character of Joseph Tregellis Price is
he's an amazing guy.
Fascinating. He refused to make any.
Quakers are always the most interesting guys in the room.
I mean,
they always are like.
And you know, I work not far from his house in Skewen and Neath.
Yeah.
So many people go past that house every day. It's got a tiny little white plaque outside to say Joseph Tregellis Price, founder of the Peace Society, used to live here. Oh, come on, people should know. People should know.
Because Henry Richard, obviously the member of Parliament for years, was the secretary for the Peace Society for years. But yeah, they just villainized the Peace Society, because I really admire the Peace Society in a world that was obsessed with armaments and war. They were a group of people that literally said, well, the only way we're ever going to move forward is if we all put it down at the same time. And I'm like, still works now. I know it's a very starry dream, but
it's almost too euphoric for humanity, isn't it? You know, it's
and no one wants to be the first to put it down
either. Especially people like Trump in the world.
Exactly. But it's mad how simple pieces to achieve, but how people are just like, no. And we've created whole industries on now, unfortunately.
You know, from your research and your knowledge, when the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders were given that order to open fire, so we do know that 24 workers were shot dead.
I would say it's between 24 and 27.
Right.
Yeah.
I've heard 26.
Yeah. It's in there somewhere. I would always go.
I've heard it more 24.
Yeah.
So
I've
countless others would have been maimed or had no quality of life thereafter.
There would have been lots of others as well. There would have been loads of others.
When that order was given to open fire, was that as a result of the workers starting to become volatile, or because the Riot Act had been read and the crowd hadn't dispersed?
The Riot Act had been read like 3 or 4 times by that point anyway. I think they would they read it in Welsh and English several times by that point, and they still were reluctant to open fire. And I think everyone was reluctant to open fire. It was just the close quarters and that intense environment that it just...
I'm going to try and put it on the spot, right? So when you say close quarters, so I said that there's testimony in the Assizes courts to say that the throngs of numbers were being pushed upon the soldiers as opposed to charging them.
Yeah.
From your research, do you think the mob at that point were being volatile, or do you think it was just...
The mob at that moment were armed. There was definitely, not all of them, definitely not all of them, but there were 100% sections of the mob that were armed with pikes or sticks or whatever armament you can. They didn't have guns, 100% didn't have guns. And so it's like they were definitely going to a gunfight with a knife type thing.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there would have been some idea of threat from them, I think. And
as opposed to, say, Peterloo, where...
Peterloo is different, because Peterloo literally was people...
Just families.
Totally unarmed, families.
Talkers.
And that pressure and the level of intensity. Because if you go to the street now, right, you won't get an idea of how narrow that space is now, because it's opened up in Penderyn Square. But if you look further up the high street, you can see how narrow that is. Imagine being in there, in that environment, with so many people, on average, anywhere between 3, 4, 5, up to 10, maybe even 12,000 people, but certainly thousands. And you are that band that have been brought in when there's no police, there's no, there's no nothing. And so I would imagine that the tensions were insane.
And how many soldiers? Do they know how many soldiers were called in?
They don't. No, they don't even know. But I think Gwynar's book, there's different. I think he did a kind of composite idea that there was around. I think I can't remember if it was the aftermath he knew or the during, but there's certainly no full agreement on the exact number, factually. But either way, they would have been vastly outnumbered. But the problem is the intensity of that situation. Is you've got a volatile crowd and you've got an equally volatile person with a gun who's being threatened and being there, and so it's.
Well, again,
really
I can't wait to share the script with you, mate. Honestly, I really can't. But
I definitely think that they didn't go into it wanting to shoot.
Well, I think we've definitely nailed that in that scene.
Yeah.
Where we've got, there's a sense of trepidation, there's a sense of fear on both sides, from Richard Jenkins, the High Sheriff, to the some of the younger soldiers who probably the first time they were ever facing any sort of conflict like this.
Massively.
To the workers who, there was fractions of the workers who were there for a rumble, but then others who would have been there just caught up in the furore of it all.
Trying to.
I do feel, obviously, like I said, I'm biased, but I think we've definitely nailed that in my script. Yeah.
I think it's one of those weird things. It's like I don't think that we could ever even closely get to what that situation would be. You can put it in a film, but the intensity that must have been is insane. And keep in mind that the crowd had proved themselves to be quite significantly violent the day prior.
Yeah.
You kind of like...
Or even off the back of the illumination campaign, from what Stefan told me, isn't there? There's windows smashed if people didn't put the candle in their window.
But the court's request, which was obviously the day one, basically, type activity. So the first thing they did was very much aimed at leveling the playing field with the court's request. So that's why they were crowds go into people's houses who had been part of that system, whether it's years or whether it's weeks or whatever. If you've ever been part of that system, we know about you. We're going to come and knock on your door and fuck shit up. That's what we're going to do. Like. And then go into the court's request and obviously starting fires and giving away the articles and turfing them out and stuff like that. People who never had anything like that. That's why I'm always trepidatious with people raising parallels between the two, because they're very, very different in every sense of the word. Because
am I right in saying though that there were laws passed on the result of what happened to Peterloo, and the first time they were broken was in Merthyr 1831?
I'm not sure actually. It might have been. I'm not sure.
There was one law that was passed: you can't march in crowds of more than 10 under a banner.
Yeah, no, that was there prior to Peterloo, I think. I think that'd been there a while, because that was an aftermath of kind of religious gatherings and stuff like that from that period where certain religions were outlawed and stuff like that, and people would worship up in the mountains. But I'm not sure. But it might have adjusted things after Peterloo. I'm not sure. But yeah, I think the crowd did themselves a disservice with starting things so violently. Like because if the very, very start was obviously them trying to get documentation from Father Gill in Aberdeen and from other people to try and pressure the wage system and stuff like that, and which is good, solid start. But then it just dipped over then into this again. That's why it always seems like there's so many different factions kicking around. And so I was basically looking at trying to understand, all right, well, what's going on in this rising? You've got people who are like clearly trying to use documentation and pressure and support to achieve goals. You've got people who are screaming reform to try and kind of say, like, we basically want a vote, we want to say in our future. And then you've got people kind of trying to take over more localized like injustices, like the court's request and things like that. So there's lots of different things going on. And but I think the faction that was responsible for the burning and the court's request and stuff, that probably had a direct hit on the day after, because again, if the Iron Masters are in this building and if there's troops outside and if they're there and they just prior burnt the bloody building down and turfed everything out in the street, then they're going to be terrified, aren't they? And they're going to be like, well, shoot. Ask questions later, shoot. But then the weirdest thing happened is that them getting the weapons and getting that extra kind of, weaponry in the aftermath added another day where they were kind of, right, now we got to defend what we've got. And it's kind of like, we'll defend like certain stations and stuff. And there was a real intensity. At what point do you think then, sort of like in the aftermath, when it all dispersed and sort of started to die down, that the game was up for the likes of Lucien, Richard Lewis? I think they knew it was up as soon as they opened fire on the crowd. I think they knew,
even though they got them to retreat to Penderyn House.
I think they knew it was bound to end in a certain way after that moment, and
which is exactly, again, I can't wait to share the script with you, right? That's exactly like what, without giving too much away, right? The sort of the crux of the conflict between Dic Penderyn, his wife, his sister, his brother-in-law, is they could all sort of see that coming, and they're trying to discourage him from getting too embroiled in protest and marching.
And that's it, because there was no other outcome after that. After they'd opened fire and troops had been injured and everything like that, then the governmental systems in place, like, in fairness to like the people in control of, you know, making those riot speeches and stuff like that, they did genuinely want this to stop. I know they didn't want it. They didn't want to concede anything, but they did want it to stop. They didn't want to make it worse. They certainly didn't want to just like Peterloo and like other like willfully cause havoc. But after that, it was like the governmental kind of spokes kicked into action, and it's like, right, they've injured soldiers, arrest them, kill them. That, you know, it was like all out.
And we spoke about this prior to me putting the camera on, but you said to me that you don't think Dic Penderyn was guilty.
No, 100%. I don't think he was guilty.
Do you think it was? Albeit there's not enough factual evidence with the deathbed confession and so on, so which we have used in the script. You know, we felt it justified for dramatic purposes. Why do you think then Dic Penderyn or Richard Lewis was innocent, and why was he hanged?
I think he's innocent because there's no evidence to say the contrary at all, and I firmly believe they were innocent until they're proven guilty, and there's not a single shred of proof to prove that he did what he was accused of doing. The eyewitnesses that placed him in the crowd, you know, it wasn't just James Abbott, which history will tell you. It's this barber, the bastard barber, who he was. There were a few people, you know, including Donald Black, who was stabbed, that said, well, he was in the crowd.
We've used that in the script. So he says, I remember Richard Lewis from the Rising. He took his cap off and waved it. Captain Sparks gave a soft laugh. That's all transcribed in the trial, you know.
Exactly right.
But he says, I don't remember him laying his hands on anyone.
Exactly right. And that for me is like a real nail in the coffin of that case, in terms of like, people can place him at that crowd in that time. Like, I know certain reports later will say that he was off in the mountains and stuff like that, like loads of other stories.
Do you think then on the 30th of August 1831 he was hanged in Cardiff as a means to show the workers you step on a line and this could happen to you?
I do, 100%. And I think it's a shame that they weren't able to get that reprieve at that point, because it was looking likely for some time. It was looking likely, and Lewis got a reprieve. And there were many other death sentences handed out initially. Like, if you look at the court transcripts, right to the very end of the assays and other things, they were like deaths and transportation all over the place, and they commuted a great many of them. But for whatever reason, that one with Dic, because he was so linked to that possible crime of stabbing that soldier and placing his hand on a king's soldier, which is tantamount to placing your hand on the king himself.
Treason,
They just wouldn't budge on it, even though there's just no evidence to support it at all. Like, I don't think the deathbed confession is a reality, like we talked about. I think that is all this kind of mythology that's stemmed up around Dic Penderyn, and there's just not enough evidence to say that we know who stabbed Donald Black at all. Donald Black didn't even know. We know he was stabbed and he nearly died, and that's about it. But I'm pretty certain that there's no evidence to implicate Dic, which means that there was an innocent man that was put in the gallows and killed. And however you look at that, it's horrendous on every level. And that's just one of the many reasons why it's good the death penalty doesn't exist.
Why then, if there were other people sentenced to be hanged, I mean, it's nice I could tap into someone's experience like yours, you know, but even with the research I've done, I've not found any reason why it was Richard Lewis as opposed to anyone else.
Yeah, me either. A lot of people put it down to the Abbott testimony and other things like that, and other bits. I think there was like scant information from one or two people saying, oh, it might have been him, or it was him, or this, that just pushed him down that route, and they had to do something in their head. They had to do something. Yeah. And they were like, the other thing you've got to remember is they were terrified of it happening again.
Yeah. It was a deterrent.
So But not only that, they were terrified of killing a person that will kickstart it again. That's why I always firmly believe that Lewis escaped and Dic Penderyn didn't, is because he was seen as this leader figure in one faction of the Rising in some way, and they were terrified. Like there's so many letters back and forth about the actions that they do in that trial and the death sentence they carry out will kickstart things back in Merthyr. They were absolutely terrified about it.
I don't think it's a coincidence. I mean, again, it's just I am an optimist, but it's a slight pessimist in me that Justice Bosanquet was promoted to the Privy Council after the trials. You know, I think that was well done.
Yeah.
You did your job. You got some up the gallows.
No, I think that's fair. Like it's not, it's one of those things, and he's a martyr because he was picked seemingly at random to take the brunt of the punishment for the crowd overall on that day, when there were so many other people that were actively like hurting people, attacking people, stealing from people in that crowd that they knew of and had evidence of, and they did nothing for that. But there's other weird sentences as well. Like there was this 62-year-old woman named Joan Jenkins. She was like one of the few women that were convicted, and she's 62. And as soon as I started looking, I was like, how on earth is a 62-year-old woman implicated in all this? What's going on? Well, she, like many, kind of saw an opportunity to reclaim goods back that had been taken from the court's request. So she entered a house of a guy called Prothero, I think his name was, and she took her stuff back with her sons. Took it back and got it, and so a watch and a few other things. Yeah. She was arrested. Such a bad influence she was on her sons and all this, that the judge gave her 2 years hard labour. Dead. She didn't see the end of her sentence out. Even though people in Merthyr, like John Guest, who, when he became MP, one of the first things he did, and I got massive issues with John Guest, but one of the first things he did is he wrote a letter to the prison saying, Joan Jenkins has never committed any crime before ever. He said, though she is dissolute in character in some respects, she's never been a criminal. Could you see fit to kind of release her, because her kidneys are failing, all this other stuff is happening to her in prison, and they didn't release her. So the sentence she had, even though it wasn't a death sentence on paper,
it directly led to a death.
It was a death sentence because she died in prison for taking back a property. And I mean, no criminal history, no nothing. Very similar to Dic in terms of like, one or two people were seemingly, they had to, they in their mind as the government kind of, in law.
Just chatting about that now, like we've almost, for me, for the first time really, even in this journey, almost answered one of the questions which we couldn't answer at the start of our conversation, which is the two characters, like Sally's differentiated in her book, the man and the martyr.
Yeah.
Why, who was the real Richard Lewis and who is Dic Penderyn, and why did that come about? Well, it came about because he was hanged for a crime that he didn't commit.
Totally. I think the idea, the mythology around, and I mean mythology in terms of what Dic is now to history and to popular culture in Merthyr and other and South Wales and stuff like that. What he is now is he's a symbol of injustice. But what he was as a man, we've got no idea really at all. Like he could have been a pisshead miner, or he could have been an amazing guy. We have no idea, none at all. But what his death led to is the kind of archetypal idea of injustice. And how no matter what you do, no matter how much you shouldn't be exposed, you shouldn't be put to death, and all that type of thing, that it does happen, and that we've got to kind of be aware, remember Dic almost. Dic Penderyn became a byword for remember this shit that can happen all the time. And it is.
And we never, so when we attached the royal prerogative of mercy idea to the stage play and now the film, we didn't do it on the back of, what Dic Penderyn, the man and the martyr said, but it lends itself to that, because we're not trying to prove innocence and guilt. We're just saying what the man represents. And with the parallels that we've got in society today, I think it'd be a perfect opportunity for Charlie to get some good street cred in Wales if he used his first royal prerogative.
He needs it, definitely. But it's strange how, in many ways, my idea of Dic has always been Richard Lewis, has always been that he was just a guy. that he was just a guy
Yeah.
who went with the mass of people who were going hell for leather on these few days in June, and was just targeted for whatever reason that was, whether it was personal grievances with Abbott, whether it was
It could
other
just
things.
been
It could have
they
been
needed
anything.
someone. They just needed
Either
someone.
way, it was him that was picked.
Yeah,
and
needed someone,
yeah,
and he was there.
he was it. But the aftermath was amazing. Like the unity they showed as well with that 11,000 kind of petition and rallying around to get him freed and stuff in the weeks leading to August 13th was an amazing feat, really. Because again, the unification of the workers, I think, is the benefit to the rise in a big way. It really unified them against all manner. And so yeah, the union thing. So by August, all the unions, and they wanted to cut wages and stuff like that. They even had like union inspectors in works. And what the union expect, like it could be you or me, where the union puts us in place, but we don't tell anyone. But what that is like in coal mines in particular, you were paid on the quality and the weight that you were bringing out and things like that. That's why you would write in chalk on the side and stuff like that, what's in there, and then people would inspect at the end of the day and pay you the equivalent of what you've got. You wouldn't get an hourly rate, like. And so they felt like they were being undercut sometimes. So a union inspector would kind of go in, check the work, and if they feel that the pay they'd been given for that work was not justified, they'd ask the union guy his opinion. He'd go, "Yeah, I think you're right," and then they'd act together as one to try and right that wrong and go against it. But then it got to the point where they were trying to like set wages, and so Dowlas, for whatever reason, Guest and Anthony Hill down in Plymouth Ironworks, despised the old system. They hated having any type of people coming in and telling them and being involved in their work. All the ironmasters did, but particularly those two at this point in history were just like against it. And so they told their workers, you either renounce your union groups totally, or you sacked, you're done. So they're done, right? They obviously, as a union, said, no, we're not going to renounce them. And so they sacked them. They put 4,000 people out of work in a day.
Was there a picket line?
There was picket lines galore, because they would be unemployed from August until late November, months and months and months. But what happened in the immediate future is what makes it so special, I think. Is like there were two other works in Merthyr, Penderyn and Cyfarthfa, both of which, luckily for them at the time, had ironmasters that agreed that they had the right to be in unions. So contrary to lots of belief, Crochet publicly would say, and Humphrey family would publicly say, but it was the Foreman family at that point, I think, but they would publicly say, the workers have got as much right to a union as I have. It is what it is. I'll work with it. Do you know what I mean? And all the Cyfarthfa workers were unionised, and all the Penderyn. So what happened is they were all paying into the union, right? They were all paying a couple of pence every week. And so the payments in were subsidising them to wait it out. And that plan that I told you earlier kicked in. They then, like en masse, let's all apply for parish relief. And then the pressure will be overwhelming and they'll have to give in to our demands. So en masse, they all applied for parish relief, thousands of workers, and they were all rejected out of hand.
Organised unification.
Yeah. Before we even understood what organised unification was, really, it had all the archetypal traits of it, everything. And the government and the union and the parish council and stuff like that met and refused them. And they were just like, why are you refusing us? Because we're unemployed, members of the parish. And they were like, yeah, but you've got work waiting for you. All you have to do is renounce your union. And so the actual governmental bodies and lawmakers in Merthyr were, complicit in this illegal activity, because they were legally allowed to have these constituted clubs, these union clubs. They were legally allowed to have them. But they were saying, well, you've got a job waiting for you. All you have to do is get rid of your club. And they were like, well, I'm not going to get rid of my club. It's a part of my life. I'm going to stay with it. And so the plan just exploded instantly because parish relief wouldn't give out. They illegally didn't pay them. And so they were like, well, what are we going to do? And so Cyfarthfa, Penderyn, Hirwaun, other works over in Tredegar and elsewhere, subsidised the workforce to stay unemployed for that period. And basically they were giving them corn, they were giving them flour, they were giving them money, they were giving them funds. But the problem was, by the point they got to November, the biggest downfall was two things. Apparently, one of the union activists and
The
organisers,
weather as well, maybe. Yeah.
one of the union activists had apparently pilfered some funds from the union fund.
Yeah.
But that history is a bit muddled up. We don't know exactly. The biggest thing for me is the sheer numbers. The sheer numbers that the unions were subsidising were just too great.
Yeah.
They were just too large, and there was an end to it. It got to the point where.
So did the unions win out in the end?
No, they didn't. It got to the point where Plymouth workers were trying to go back, and Carmarthen workers were stopping them.
No.
Yeah, and they were like, "We can't. We're not giving in. We're not giving in."
Parallels with what went on in the 1980s.
Yeah, 100%. It's so close, like it's insane. But eventually, by late November, there was like this celebratory kind of article in the papers at the time, because all the papers are mainly conservative papers, you probably know most at the time anyway. And they were like, oh, all the workers, bar a couple, are now back in employment. All of them are announced their unions and stuff like that, and they've gone on. And unions wouldn't come back into Merthyr until like 36, 37, 38, going into the 1840s, and they would become far more established. But what they achieved there, in my eyes, in terms of like, people look at the Merthyr Rising and think of the achievements and think of the impact there, and it's great. But what you achieved in the aftermath was insane. It's like the workers unified en masse to organise a prolonged strike, funding and feeding families from all over the borough and some neighbour boroughs for all this time in trying to win.
It's remarkable what people can achieve when they come together. I think and I've said this all along with the stage production. There's a lot of people who said you're not going to be able to take a community vehicle to the Edinburgh Fringe with 35 people. We did it.
Yeah.
With the film, there's people who have said all along it's just a pipe dream, and the way in which we'll tell Dic Penderyn a story to the world is like our ancestors by coming together.
Yeah. And that's 100% what it's all about.
That's obviously the romantic in me as well, But
no, but it is the case.
It's so like true.
There's only ever been mass change when it's
come together as one.
Yeah, it is. Same as Chartism. Chartism was that kind of hook that unified a lot of people. They could hang their hat on that banner. Whereas before it was like, oh, you like this, I like this. So it's a great example actually. Early on in the 19th century, workers and middle managers would get together to have certain clubs like philosophical societies and stuff like that. And people, furnacemen with a couple of quid, they'd go there and they do scientific experiments and stuff like that. And early on, they decided, right, we've got a ban talking about politics here, because half the room loved Napoleon and half the room hate Napoleon, and they were always battling. And it's like
parallels with what's going on today,
And there's always been this kind of like amongst the workers of Merthyr, there's always been this duality between the left and the right, and both existing.
One of the difficulties we found with the socials for the Iniquity Calon project and now with Calon Films is when people try and get, with the social media platforms and the division within society today, and people jumping on their soapbox and all arguing with each other. And what we're trying to say is, look, this is not what the story represents. The story is about people coming together. Have difference of opinions by all means. Let's try and keep the rhetoric as inclusive as possible.
I know. It's easily done though. It's like it's mad how people get so adamant of their view that they kind of get angry and anxious that someone isn't seeing it. And it's like, well, people are individuals and they're just gonna take it off in different directions, and it is what it is. Like and history in particular is so open to interpretation. It's insane, and it's a difficult
honestly,
thing.
I can't wait to share.
I
can't wait to share the script. I can't wait to come and watch the film.
Yeah, it'd be lovely.
Because I do believe that we've struck that balance.
Yeah,
we've done the story justice, which is always important to me, and I know it was to the late Stefan. But I can't wait to share it with you, mate.
Yeah, it'd be great. It'd be really good to see.
Knock us off now.
Yeah, carry on, man. Thank you, man.
I really enjoyed this. It's probably one of the best chats we've had. Lynn was pretty good, mate.